So imagine if you went home today and heard that 20 people in Rockland were murdered today. And now imagine if you go home tonight and you hear that 20 refugees drowned trying to get to Europe. So what's different enough about those two statements to make your empathy towards them so much different? The purpose of my speech today is to persuade you to avoid using othering or dehumanizing language, or to avoid sources that do. This is really important today because a lot of the sources that we get information from are going to use a lot of othering tactics in order to make their point, and it's one of the leading causes of people or groups of people becoming or doing evil things. As far as my credibility on this, I've tried very hard since I first learned about this to avoid any othering language myself, and to avoid any sources that use it. So today I'm going to be talking about how to recognize othering, how or why it makes you evil, and then how to avoid it. So I talked a little bit about the definition of othering being language that is going to dehumanize groups of people, but specifically it's when you refer to people or a group of people by some label that can describe them rather than as a person. And most of the research on this topic was done by Philip Zimbardo, who was the former head of the American Psychological Association, who also is famous for doing the Stanford Prison Experiment. But he's prolific. He's done a ton of work on this topic and a ton of interviews, ton of writing, so really credible resource on the topic. And he did find in his research that it is the number one cause for groups of people becoming evil versus good. And it often is tied in with delegation of authority. We'll get more into that. So some examples to help solidify the idea in your mind. If you can imagine lots of things that the president has said about Mexicans, for example, being racists or bad hombres, or about Muslims. There's lots of examples, and those contexts. When you say something like Mexicans are rapists, there's no way to discredit that, because you can't say you can't give a counterexample, because there's no it's not really a factual statement. If you were to say all people who are Mexicans are rapists, well, that's crazy. I know Mexicans that are not rapists. But if you say Mexicans are rapists, the logic just doesn't work that way in your mind, and it delegates authority to him, and it tells you that this group of people is bad. Lots of examples on both sides. Hillary famously said that half of Trump supporters are deplorables, and that's sort of absurd. You can't really argue with that because she's not actually claiming anything specific. Whereas if she was to say half of all the people who support Trump are deplorable people, that would just be absurd. You'd be thinking, I can think of 3 or 4 that aren't. There's another really good example, which I heard falsely attributed to Malcolm X, which was if they kill one of us, kill 2 of them. And that's actually, there's lots of different people that have used that saying. It's common all throughout the history of, especially in America, of different revolutionary groups. But it's the same thing. It takes everyone in our group and everyone in their group and makes them enemies, and you have to pick a side, and you have to kill each other. There's no question of whether that's the right thing to do, what was the situation here. So now that I've talked about how you can recognize it, let's talk about how it makes you evil. So tying directly into that, Philip Zimbardo, that doctor who I mentioned, famously defined evil as intentionally behaving or causing others to act in ways that demean, dehumanize, harm, destroy, or kill innocent people. So right there you can see examples of anyone who accepted those statements, okay, that's true, has become evil because they were able to dehumanize that group in their mind, according to this definition. So one famous example from his early work is the Stanford Prison Experiment, which you can see on the first page of the packet. And they used these othering tactics to, for example, the prisoners were dressed up not as people, their faces were covered, they have a number, not a name, they're not allowed to use their name. The guards were put in this perfect situation to dehumanize the other side of the group. And they did. And it was so bad after just 6 days that they canceled the 2-week experiment because of the way they were treating each other. And they had this like Stockholm syndrome when they told them it was over. They didn't understand that they were still in an experiment. It's crazy how deep it gets into your psychology. And those results were published, not by Zimbardo, who at the time was less prominent, though he worked on it, but by Haney in the International Journal of Criminology and Penology. So there's something you may not know, that if you look at the next page, almost exactly the same thing happened in real life in Iraq in 2003 at one of our prisons there, where researchers looking back at it, led by Dr. Tinde, published in the journal Experimental Social Psychology, determined that specifically Christians who were targeting Muslims dehumanized one another to the point where they literally did the same things. And there's pictures of them leading them like dogs by a chain. There's pictures of them dressing them up with their heads covered so that they don't look like people. It's all the same stuff, and it really happened. So it's not just theory. There's another great example from a little bit longer ago by Stanley Milgram, which was published in the Journal of Abnormal Social Psychology. And he put people, this is on the 3rd page, he put people in this experimental setup where they would have to electrocute one another, starting with 14 volts and going all the way to 450 if the other person got a question wrong on a questionnaire. And almost everyone got to 450, but all of them started at 14 volts. So it's important to recognize that everything starts somewhere, and it almost always starts with dehumanizing, and it's easy to avoid. So let's talk about how we can avoid it. Don't use dehumanizing words like the homeless. Try saying something like people who don't have somewhere to sleep tonight. Turn their tragedy into tragedy, not an insult. And avoid sources that use it on the news. So in conclusion, I've told you about how to recognize it, how it makes you evil, and how to avoid it. So if you don't want to be tricked into doing evil things, try to think of people as people. Thanks. So it's a little cliche, but I like the content. This is an important thing that I don't think people think about. I'm glad that I have like a venue to talk about it for a few minutes. Timing was an issue. I feel like I could have talked a lot longer about this, but I guess it works.
It's the double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Your non-verbals, your verbals is what I meant, not non. They were all like super excellent, but what I would say like was the most impressive, I didn't hear you like stutter over any word or like it was all so clear and so fluid. I understood every single thing you said. There wasn't a single point where I was like, oh, he just like messed up or anything like that. It was really impressive.
Thanks. What could I do better? Anyone?
I think your visual aids may not have been the best. I think we all know Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
And you could have just quoted them without.
I didn't want the other than.
Yeah.
Nice save.